Hi, this is Jim Carroll. Welcome to the Matt Ballaker podcast.
Today's guest is comfortable behind a guitar or a grill. He's been a CFO. He's now a wealth advisor and portfolio manager and author of Vixology. Please welcome Jim Carroll to the program. How you doing, Jim?
Doing well, thank you.
So you are very well traveled, but I want our viewers to get a little bit more about the younger Jim. Where did you grow up, Jim?
That should be a simple answer, but it takes a minute. My father was an accidental career Army officer. He was in the Army Air Corps in World War II, served in North Africa and Italy, came home to San Diego, which is where his family had been since the 1870s, if you can believe that. Went back to work with his father in a construction business. His father passed away, and my dad didn't get along with his father's partner, so he went back in the Army and finished out 29 years. So I was actually born in Queens, New York, but we moved before I was one, and we didn't stop moving until he retired, just as I was going to high school. He moved us back to San Diego, and then it felt like it was my turn. So I graduated high school, went off to college, spent 4 years in the Army myself after that, came east to go to business school, wound up in New York.
Wow. Yeah, we got
never stopped.
Following Dad's lead. So you mentioned you moved out of Queens when you were a baby. What is the first place that you remember? What was your first quote unquote home?
Wow. I guess the first memory that I think that I have was outside of my grandmother's house in San Diego, my mother's mother. Both of my grandmothers lived in San Diego, so we would spend time there, and I have a vague recollection of being outside of her house as a tot. But the first place I really remember was our first stop. We lived in Virginia for a total of 8 years in two different places. Fort Belvoir, which is in Alexandria, sort of suburban Washington, D.C., and then at Fort Myer, which is in Arlington, right across the river from D.C. and where all the Pentagon generals lived. So it was really Fort Belvoir in Alexandria. And I remember that our house backed up on some woods that had creeks and frogs and all kinds of things that my brother and I could run around and collect and bring home to mom.
Not a ton of creeks and woods in San Diego. I'm a San Diegan myself, but what advice would you give, Jim, to kids who are continually uprooted? What's it like? What would you tell them?
Look, I didn't have a choice, and I didn't realize that what I went through was unusual in any way, right? I had nothing to compare it to, because as soon as I made friends someplace, we moved away. And the first two places that I remember, I was in school with other Army kids. So everybody was in the same boat, as it were. And, stay flexible. I learned how to adapt. I think, unfortunately, my kids grew up in the same little town, went to the same school, K through 12. They've got friends from those years that they'll have for the rest of their lives. And I didn't have that growing up. So, I had to kind of reinvent myself every 4 years or every few years until I got to New York. And so I kind of missed out on that lifelong friendship aspect of growing up in one place.
Yeah, I mean, there's always trade-offs. You do miss out on lifelong friendships, but you're more resilient. You can reinvent yourself more than Madonna. So if you're a nerdy kid at one school, you can be a tough jock at another school. So, I mean, there's some upside too. I want to know, when did you cultivate your love for music, Jim?
Wow. I can remember I have two older sisters who were 5 and 7 years older. So when I was, in the late elementary school years, I had these two older sisters listening to the radio and playing records, and it introduced me to, rock and roll, the British Invasion, all of the Beatles, the Monkees, Herman's Hermits. It was just this cacophony coming out of the radio, much to the chagrin of my parents, which is probably the first reason I liked it, was because my parents didn't, and it was just there. And I don't know why it kind of spoke to me, but I became, a fan of what was on the radio. And as soon as I could get control of the dial, FM radio was playing rock and roll. early in the day, and it spoke to me in a way that I couldn't really describe. I wasn't a musician. I did go to a school. We lived in Hawaii for 4 years, my dad's last tour of duty, and I was fortunate that the Army paid for the kids to go to school. So I went to the Iolani School for Boys, a private school in Honolulu, and sang in the choir because you had to do something musical. And I didn't want to play. They wanted me to play the trumpet, and I said, "Is there another option?" They said, "Yeah, you can sing in the choir." So that's what I did.
I like how that to prepare your father for retirement, he's stationed in Honolulu. That's a nice kind of easing into.
Well, that's a longer story how we wound up there, but it was pretty great. In many respects, life was downhill ever after.
If you're hanging on the beaches of Honolulu, it's only downhill from there. So you had this kind of rebellious angst that turned you on to more rock kind of music. You said no to the trumpet, but you're singing in the choir. So how did you transition from singing in the choir to eventually doing bar shows?
Wow. It was college when I had a couple of buddies who knew how to play the guitar. And I said, well, gee, I got to do that too. So, I bought a guitar and brought it back to school my sophomore year and started to learn a few things. And I never really got good. I don't have, I was reminded of the Mark Knopfler song, mind he's strictly rhythm. He doesn't want to make it cry or sing. I was never able to make the guitar cry or sing. And I once described my acumen as I play guitar just well enough to sing the blues. It was really just something that, again, that interested me. I loved music, wanted to learn how to play some music. So I took it up and, pestered my friends to teach me some things and became a lifelong hack at playing guitar. But yeah, got to actually the first band I was in. So my father was a career Army officer. I paid my way through college with an ROTC scholarship. My timing was impeccable. It was just after Vietnam and before all of the Middle East became a mess. So I served 4 years of active duty at the Presidio of San Francisco. Anybody who's been to San Francisco knows where I'm talking about. It is like the perfect place if you've got to be in the Army. And there was a little music school just off campus down in the marina. So I figured, well, let me go sign up for some stuff there. And they had what was essentially a class where you signed up to be in a band. So I did that. And that was really my first band experience. And then in business school, there were a bunch of us who had some experience before. So we put a band together, and our lead singer had actually taken a year off as an undergrad to tour his band. He was a semi-pro and a great entertainer. So we put a band together called Reverend Hurricane and the Soul Bazookas, and played bars in Boston, played campus events, and we recruited some groupies. So we had the Bazookettes. Well, we needed a road crew, but we had no roadies. That was on us.
What reason is there to be in a band other than having groupies? So you might call yourself a lifelong hack, but I think you made it, Jim. I'm curious. So you went to a school in Boston called Harvard. Many people might be unfamiliar with it, but I wrote a book about the late great Greg Giraldo, who went to law school at Harvard, and there was a bar that would serve these hurricane bowls. Do you know what I'm
Scorpion
talking?
bowls.
Scorpion bowls. Have you had a scorpion bowl, and what was your experience, Jim?
Well, so when I was there, we would take a bridge across the river to Cambridge, to Harvard Square, and there were 3 bars. Oh gosh. The new one at the time was called the Boathouse, and it was the first beer on the right as you crossed the bridge. God, what was the name of the place there, the Scorpion Bowls? It was the Bermuda Triangle at the time. There were 3 bars that basically formed the Bermuda Triangle, and there were many, many, many nights lost in the triangle. Scorpion Bowls. Yeah, that was kind of like, Everclear punt.
Yeah. He had a story of passing out on a frozen sidewalk, and then he was rushed to the hospital, and he survived. But I want to rewind a little bit. So you were in the Army, and then you ended up going to Harvard Business School. What prompted that?
Well, I came to realize that I was not going to follow my dad's lead and have a career in the Army. It had paid for school and it had paid for school and served a purpose, but so I needed to pivot, to use a word that we didn't use in those days. And I was lucky. I have a cousin, same age. He was and is the family genius. And I heard that she was going to go back to business school. And she was a year ahead of me in that process. She had taken a job as an engineer. I think she was working at Chevron. She again lived in the Bay Area. And so I got a hold of her and said, Connie, I hear you're going back to business school. What's the story? And she said, well, Jim, I've done all the research. I've applied to the top 10 schools. I've been accepted at all of them. And I've narrowed it down to Stanford and Harvard. She's done all the work. All I have to do is apply to a couple of schools. I looked in my checking account. And I had enough money for a couple of applications. And in fairness, I had looked at Berkeley, living in the Bay Area. Maybe I'll go part-time. And they had accepted me to go part-time and said, if you want to come full-time, please do. The Army was not going to pay for me to go back to business school because I did not graduate from West Point. Their loss.
Exactly.
So I applied to Stanford and Harvard. I had no clue other than talking to my cousin. I wasn't in an analyst program. I wasn't working, for McKinsey out of college. I didn't have anybody to compare notes with except my cousin. So I applied. I get to Harvard, and I discover the first week that the reason I'm there is because they love ex-military people. They are a school that is, designed to train leaders, and we had all had leadership experience. For better or for worse, from day one in the military, I was in charge of something. Whether I knew what that meant or not, didn't matter. Hey, Lieutenant, you're in charge of this thing. Try not to break it. So they thought that was a great pedigree. So they let me in. What can I say?
So they let you in, and other than playing in your band and enjoying a few Scorpion Bowls, what did you learn that you could apply later?
I think, Harvard has a different approach, as you know. They are a case study school. Your classes are all about absorbing, tearing through a case and being prepared to talk about it in class. And so I think the goal is to teach you a set of skills that are not just, formulas, procedures, but how to think, how to analyze, and then how to communicate. So I think thinking, analyzing, communicating, these were, things that I'd had some experience with, but I really do think that it prepared me to, be even more of a leader, if you will, than I had already been prepared to do. Introduced me to, subject matter that was not familiar to me. I forgot the part where I quit economics as an undergrad and became a psychology major because the guy said assume rational behavior, and I had a hard time doing that. So I had been in the Army for 4 years, and before that, I'd been a psychology major. So getting job interviews, notwithstanding the fact that I was at Harvard Business School, was not exactly like falling off a log. I had to work a little harder to get the job interviews that some of my classmates were getting because, they'd spent 2 years at Goldman Sachs or they'd spent 2 years at McKinsey or wherever.
So maybe you can clear up a rumor, Jim. I heard that at Harvard Business School, the case studies, all the groups need to prepare, and then the professor will just pick one at random, and then that group presents. What's the reality?
No, that is the reality. Well, so at least when I was there, I'm guessing that it's still a feature of the school. There's an element of self-organization. You arrive and you're part of a section. I think we had 70 kids in our section, and you have a section gathering on the first or second day of school, and you're meeting all these people you're going to spend the next year with, and you look around and you say, okay, well, that person looks like a jerk, or that person looks like, and you self-organize into what they called study groups. And I'm guessing it's still the same. So I was part of a 4-person study group. One guy had an engineering background. One guy had a family business manufacturing background. One guy had sort of an accounting background. And then there was me who knew nothing except, being in the Army and a little bit of psychology. But you sit in class and the professor walks in and points at somebody and says, get it started. And my second day, that happened to me in the accounting class. Accounting. I took one accounting class in college and said, I'll never do this again. Had a roommate who went on to be, a successful CPA. I didn't want to be like him, but here I am. I've been talking to somebody at lunch. This was an afternoon class, the second day of school, and I realized that the work I had done on the case was totally useless, and he sort of felt sorry for me and gave me a few hints. And our professor was at the time the only female full professor at the business school. Her name was Regina Hertzlinger. Later became very famous for her work with not-for-profits and just, but a very Mae West kind of character. She saunters into the classroom, rolls one of the boards up and gets herself prepared and turns around and looks and says, "So, Jim." And I said, I was trying to hide out. I was in what they called the sky deck, the very last row. Yeah. And I said, well, Professor Hertzlinger, would you like the answer I had last night or the one I got at lunch? A slight giggle from the audience. And she smiled and said, I don't care. Just get us started. So I did. I survived. She thought it was kind of funny. Good thinking on your feet, rookie.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the nature of the beast there. You can try to run, but you can't hide. The odds are sooner or later you're going to get called on. So, the emphasis is on being prepared. You actually got to read this stuff because, the professor might come in that day and say, hey, Matt, it's your turn. Let's go.
Yeah. Imagine that, needing to read before a class. That's a foreign concept, Jim.
What a concept.
So unfortunately, you weren't able to stay at Harvard forever. What was the first quote unquote real job you had post business school?
So I had an interview with a guy who felt sorry for me because he had been in the Navy and was a partner in the M&A group, a little place called Smith Barney. May it rest in peace. So he took pity on me and I got a job offer to join the corporate finance team at Smith Barney at a time when it was really still a smallish independent operation. I think at the time it had some ownership from the Saudis, but embarked on a long saga of mergers and acquisitions and split ups and dust ups and then ultimately was absorbed in a couple of different transactions. But yeah, the first real job was in the investment banking group at Smith Barney.
So did you have to wear a white shirt with a blue collar on it or a blue shirt with a white collar?
There was a lot of that going around. You had you had the offset color shirts. You had lots of stripes. You had the guys wandering around with their suspenders, smoking cigars.
Nice.
Oh yeah, no, this was back in the day. Certainly before DEI. It was, and again, in over my head, a lot to learn. Lots of late nights and weekends.
So I have a quick question about that because I've never worked for like quote unquote big corporate or like a big firm, but I've done lots of different jobs. Why are analysts there so late? Like I don't think they can be productive. Is it just like a pissing contest? Like that's something I've never really got like a straight answer. Like I don't understand it. Can you give me your opinion?
Well, yeah, look, I think the formula really is, how can we process as much business as possible with as few people as we can get away with. And so if you're an analyst or an associate, actually what you're trying to learn as much as you can. So part of it is self-inflicted in the sense that, the way I'm going to get ahead in this organization is by producing as much good work product as I possibly can for as many people as I can. You want to work with as many different partners. You don't know, where you might click, who might decide they like you. You're learning like crazy. And so there's a lot to do. Does it result in occasional burnout? Does it result in occasional, bad outcomes for kids who, get chewed up. Yes, I don't know. Were we more resilient than the current crew? I don't know. But
Yes,
it was just,
I've done the research, and you were, but please continue.
look, it was part of the program. It was what we signed up for. We kind of knew it going in. And so you tried to work smarter. One of the first things somebody said was, if your phone rings after 5 o'clock on a Friday, don't answer it because it's somebody who wants you to work over the weekend. And, but you did what you needed to do, or you washed out. And there were people who washed out, people who said, there's got to be a better way. I sort of chose it because I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about, this whole New York finance thing, and figure out if it was what I wanted to do because I didn't know. Again, my experience was limited to what had become irrelevant job opportunities. So I saw it kind of as a test.
And how long did you take this test? How long were you in investment banking?
I was in investment banking for 16 years.
Wow. So I think you either are a very slow test taker or you excelled. What's the truth?
You know, um, when I met my wife, she was an associate in the investment banking group at Goldman Sachs. She hated it. She said, I don't see how you can deal with this. You can't really like it. And I said, well, I guess I must like it at least 51% of the time
Mhm.
because I'm still doing it. There were places along the way where opportunities presented themselves. A couple of times I had clients who tried to get me to come on board to, be a CFO or do M&A for the client rather than be the freelance investment banking operator. I ultimately took one of those as a way to try something different.
And what was that?
It was in 1999, and there might have been an internet thing going on. There might have been any number of investment bankers who answered the siren song to, get some of them stock options and get rich. So I was the chief financial officer of a company in the music industry that went public in March of 2000,
Wow.
right as the bubble had reached its limits. We were all rich for about 5 minutes.
Yeah. So what's that like to be rich for a cup of coffee?
Well, it was an experience. That's for sure, and it was a different experience. And I think there's always been a little bit of a closet entrepreneur in me. I worked with a number of entrepreneurs as an investment banker, and what I observed was that they didn't realize that they couldn't do what they wanted to do, so they went ahead and did it. You hear this about people not recognizing how risky. Are you crazy? Don't you understand how risky that is? And they don't see the risk, for whatever reason, from where they came from, how they view the world, what they see as their own capacity. So they just go do it. Most of the huge success stories, in our country and in the world are people who just, went ahead and did what everybody else thought was impossible.
Oh yeah. If you spend so much time analyzing the risks or knowing what's ahead, you'll never do anything.
You'll be petrified. Yeah. So,
Exactly.
so I think, part of it was scratching that itch for me. Ultimately it was not the final chapter. Unlike Mark Cuban, I didn't get to sail away into the billionaire sunset as a result of, making billions of dollars from the internet. But it was, again, it was another great experience.
Well, that's a very tough militaristic way of handling it. It was a great experience. So you didn't stop working at the start of the millennia. So then what?
So from investment banking days, as you collect a few shekels and put them in the bank and, you're surrounded by finance and investing and all this stuff. And so I had started to figure out, okay, well, what do I want to do? I've got a little bit of savings. I had learned from business school about, different styles of investing. I was attracted to, value investing, the Buffettology. I wasn't picking stocks, but I was picking managers. So I started investing in, at the time it was really mutual funds. We really didn't have a selection of ETFs, and picking value oriented managers. And if you look back at the internet bubble, it was a bubble in the technology business, but there were a lot of other businesses that kind of sailed right through that period of time, and a number of value-oriented managers who did well. So I actually managed to do pretty well, not because of any specific smarts that I had, other than thinking, you know, this technology stuff looks like it could come unglued, which it did. Had some friends who asked for advice, and ultimately I decided, to open up shop as an investment advisor, and came to realize that if I took this thing called the Series 65, I could be a registered investment advisor, uh, and I did it solo, which in hindsight sounds pretty stupid, but got to scratch that entrepreneurial itch again.
Oh yeah. Instead of joining with a big registered investment advisor, you went on your own, and what was that like?
Well, uh, I think it had a lot of benefits. I could do things the way I saw fit. I didn't need to fit myself into somebody else's mold or operate within somebody else's constraints. Didn't have to have somebody looking over my shoulder telling me, how to do what to do, or, comply with the latest directive from headquarters someplace else. So I think, and oh, by the way, it kind of forced me to say, okay, do I have an investment process? Do I have an investment discipline? How do I frame that up? How do I think that stacks up against just, sort of 60/40?
Yeah. Do you have an investment process? Do you have an investment discipline?
And am I willing to inflict that on innocent bystanders, on my clients? So it was great in terms of kind of forcing me to codify what I thought an investment process looked like. And um, it's, again, I didn't realize that I should have done it some different way, so I did it my way.
You did it my way.
Call me Frank Sinatra.
I was going to say Frankie's looking down and tipping his cigar to you. So I was in the RIA world for a few minutes, and one thing that always bugged me is when, this is just my opinion, when people would refer to stock market declines as volatility, and they would say, "Oh, investors hate volatility," and my kind of pig brain thinking was, no, investors hate having less money. So that's just kind of the kind of thorn in my side. But I know you have a Substack focus on analyzing volatility. So I guess, what is volatility? How'd you get into this, Jim?
I was talking to somebody earlier today and recounted the story. I'll try to keep it brief. This goes back to 2015-ish, at a time when the smart guys, the pundits, the vanguards, the GMOs, the Black Rocks, were looking at PE multiples for stocks and thinking, geez, this is kind of expensive. And they were looking at interest rates and thinking, gee, these are kind of low. So the outlook for stocks and bonds going forward, it's kind of, So I'm scratching my head saying, oh, this is great. What am I going to do? How am I going to differentiate myself? How am I going to deliver for clients? Looked at, what can I invest in for clients that maybe has less correlation to stocks and bonds? I've done all the research on commodities and why they're a great diversifier. And the answer is because when stocks make money, they lose money, and vice versa. So, well, I get it, but that's not very attractive. And I came across some work that had been done in this volatility thing. And, the VIX was out there, but you couldn't trade it. VIX futures had come around in 2004. And coming out of the global financial crisis, Wall Street, in its infinite wisdom, had invented some new exchange traded products that allowed you to bet directionally on whether volatility was going to go up or down. So I, went down the rabbit hole. Did a whole bunch of research. There was a bunch of academic research. There was some practical application research, and just got involved in coming up with a systematic approach to include some of this, what I refer to as long short volatility, into portfolios using these exchange traded products that frankly are not Buffett famously referred to derivatives once as weapons of mass destruction. Of course, he's one of the biggest users of WMD. And I would say that, these exchange traded products, are potentially very dangerous. I refer to what I do as juggling nitroglycerin. We saw going back to February of 2018, Volmageddon, that, small changes in the market environment can be very disruptive. But, that just scares most people away and, leaves room for me to do what I want to do. Um, and it's not a fit with every portfolio, but um, it's definitely something that can be additive, and it's definitely something that tends to have a low correlation.
Yeah, what type of portfolios would it be a fit for, or could it be a fit for?
Well, I think volatility is volatile. And so, even if you're sort of like saying, gee, this is great, but it bounces around a lot and that really kind of makes me unsettled. So if something that bounces around a lot is unsettling, then maybe it doesn't belong in your portfolio. It also is generally tax inefficient. So it works best in, retirement accounts or other tax sheltered investments. Private placement life insurance is a structure that we use to make taxes go away under certain circumstances for certain clients. So again, it's not something that is right for everybody, but it can be quite additive where people can get comfortable with what we're doing.
Right. So it's right in certain circumstances. And one takeaway I have is volatility is volatile. So I'm gonna write that down, Jim. I know
Well,
you.
witness the last month, you
Yeah.
know.
So talk about. I mean, we do a lot of evergreen content here, but there's a lot of tariff fear, hysteria. It certainly has created drops. It has created ups and downs. How would adding volatility products influence a portfolio?
Done carefully. Uh, Again, you can identify circumstances where think of it as hedging, but in certain circumstances, you're essentially amplifying returns, right? When the stock market is going from the lower left to the upper right, and let's say you're looking at the S&P 500 as an investment opportunity, looking at a short volatility product um, will be directionally correlated with that S&P 500. But when things are stable and marching higher, you essentially amplify the return uh, through a short volatility position. If you can find it that if you can get the timing right and change horses and be long volatility into the kind of correction we've seen recently, that is definitely a counter-cyclical and offsetting head to your equity positioning. And so, similar to a hedge, it can help people stay invested in times when they might otherwise not feel good about that.
Yeah, it's like if you're flying over bad weather and the plane's shaking, that this might help stabilize it in certain circumstances. I know now, Jim, you're at Ballast Rock. Uh, how how did that happen? What's the story there?
So Ballast Rock is a relatively young firm. Um, it really has been around 6 or 7 years. In its original incarnation was really almost a private equity construct. The founders all had been former, you know, big time players at one of the major firms. I alternately refer to us as Wall Street refugees and the new carpetbaggers since we all came south.
That could be the name of your new bar band, but please
Yeah,
continue.
the new carpetbaggers. They started with a fund that invested in Sunbelt multifamily real estate through some connections they created with folks who knew real estate on the ground better than they did. And that was back in the 2018, 2019 timeframe. Rather than confuse brains with a bull market, they were in a good place at a good time. And that worked well. Fast forward through a couple of other efforts that they put together, they started to gather a client base that wanted a broader set of services, including portfolio management. So they formed the Ballast Rock Private Wealth RIA right about 3 years ago. So, again, on the private wealth side, we're relatively young as an organization, but staffed with folks who've been around a couple of times like me. And so we're kind of having fun. I mean, it's a great group. I have tremendous respect for my partners, and we're bringing together a very solid team. And I think we all have enough experience to recognize that whether 60/40 is dead or not, it's incomplete in the modern world. There are other things that one should consider putting in a portfolio, whether that's private equity, private credit, venture capital, private real estate. Um, you know, and we can argue the extent to which some of those are more correlated than they seem to be. Private credit, does it really get marked to market? Again, we do our homework to identify managers and funds that we have confidence in. In many cases, these are people we know and maybe have known for 20 years. So I think, we bring a knowledge base and a perspective that can be very valuable to our clients in putting together what we think are more resilient portfolios.
More resilient portfolios. I like that. And so you started off as a sort of solo practitioner RIA, and now you've teamed up with some people. You've had a very impressive career arc. Jim, what do you think is the most painful lesson you've learned?
Haven't had that question asked recently. Look, if you have put yourself out there as a human being, as a professional, you've been punched in the face at least once or twice. I have been punched in the face, a couple of times pretty good. I think and you do have to ask yourself at times like that, am I doing what I should be doing? Is this the right course for me? Is this the right path? Because it might not be. And maybe your quote unquote failure is a function of you trying to do something that really isn't what you were put here to do. So I think, reintroduce the word resilient in a different context. I think is around the corner. Sooner or later, you're probably going to find some, and the tale that gets told is based on how you responded to that. So I think uh, a certain self-analysis, self-evaluation, grit, and resilience are kind of what it takes to really accomplish almost, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. Don't talk to me if you've never had a problem, if you've never made a mistake, if you've never had a failure, because the odds are you also haven't accomplished much.
Right. I like that. So grit and resilience can help you get over getting punched in the face. I think that's important. What have you done professionally, Jim, that you're most proud of?
I would say, and it goes back to my investment banking days, because currently I spend less time as a sort of mentor or boss. This business is much more independent than back in the investment banking days. I think I was good at spotting and grooming talent. I can point to any number of people who worked for me at one point in time who went on to knock the cover off the ball, whether it be, as investment bankers or because they spun themselves off doing something else. My favorite success story was a young man that I hired when he was at Yale. He was a member of the Whiff and Poofs, the a cappella group. He was a classical pianist, and he was a double major in molecular biology and biomechanics or some crazy. And he looked like a football player. He went on to, he was a really, really, I mean, he was the best hire ever made. He's been the CEO of a biopharmaceutical company for, I don't know, 20 plus years now. And it's just, killed it. And is a super human being.
Wow. He's talented, good looking, successful. I hate him and I've never met him, but
You would now, again, I'm not naming names. He's had his own. He would tell you that he's had his own trials and tribulations.
I'm sure he has. I'm obviously joking, but yeah, no, it shows like you're kind of like Mike Krzyzewski. You're a coach, and now you have all these tree branches that leads to other successes. So that's very cool. What are you most optimistic about?
Picked a bad time to ask me that question. I was having a conversation with a another advisor outside of Ballast Rock this morning, and I said, if you're 25 years old and you got a good job and you're saving money and you're putting it away, and you have an unlimited risk tolerance, you'll be fine as long as we don't destroy capitalism. And he said, well, interesting you say that, because for the first time in my life, I'm concerned that we may be destroying capitalism. Um, so, I on the one hand, I would like to have faith in humankind and be optimistic. On the other hand, there's part of me that feels like we're at a very significant crossroads at a time in our. I was going to use the word evolution, and I will, but then I'm reminded of the band Devo. I would like to be optimistic that we'll get to the other side of what's going on in the world these days, because a lot of it is kind of deeply disturbing. But I will maintain my personal optimism, and try to reflect that in everything that I do.
Yeah, well, grit and determination will help us get through this and hopefully preserve capitalism for subsequent generations.
I hope so.
Well, Jim, where can people learn more about you, Vixology, what you're up to?
Well, Ballast Rock Private Wealth website is ballastrockpw.com. I have a Substack called Vixology. It sounds like mixology, but with a V at the beginning. We make volatility cocktails, and that's on Substack. So vixology.substack.com. And I've been on X/Twitter for quite a while, and I am the Vixologist on X. So those are 3 places that people can track me down and
Be sure to check it out.
learn more about what I do.
Definitely learn more about Jim Carroll. And Jim, I really appreciate you being on the program. Thank you.
Matt, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.